Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. So I welcome everyone. Good afternoon to those in the DC area, and evening in Europe, and wherever you are around the world. We have a global audience today. It's a real pleasure to help introduce the new release of an index that's produced annually by Transparency International on global corruption. It's a corruption perceptions index, was released earlier today, and we're fortunate to have a couple of the Transparency International participants who were involved in that report with us to explain a bit about their findings, and then to have join us also Ben Judah, who's a investigative journalist and think tanker who is also very involved on these topics to bring out the results of the report. What's interesting, without preempting our speakers, is to say, you know, what the real takeaway for me is that the pandemic has not only been a pandemic of disease, it's been a pandemic of corruption, and that the two have gone hand in hand, and that the disease has accelerated trends of corruption in many parts of the world. So that's what we want to explore today, but also talk about the bigger issue, the strategic issue of corruption. President Biden has called corruption a national security issue that can no longer be ignored. So we hope to explain and explore some of those elements. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, but the audience is invited to participate. I'll tell you this a couple times during the show, but you can join us with comments or questions through email by sending a comment or question whenever you'd like to GEP, so Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. So again, through email at GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. So without further ado, let me introduce our Transparency International colleagues. Roberto Kukuczka, who's in Berlin joining us today, who is a lead researcher for the Corruption Perceptions Index, and Jonathan Cushing, who I believe is in London, joining us from Transparency International, who has had particular expertise and background on their global health initiative. So you bring those two themes together, and I think that's what makes this report so interesting. I'm going to ask each of them to give us some key takeaways of the index today, and then we'll go into some discussion and bring in Ben as we go along. So I believe, Roberto, you're going to start us off, please.
Yes, well, hello, and good afternoon or evening, wherever you are, or morning, I don't know. It's a pleasure to be here today, so thank you very much for the invite and for the opportunity to be here. As you said, we launched the Corruption Perceptions Index earlier today, and this is one of Transparency International's main corruption measurement tools. So it's just one of the tools that we have in our toolkit, so to speak, to approximate what corruption looks like globally. This is our expert measurement survey, so to speak. This is our expert measure of corruption. And for those who are not familiar with Transparency International, we're the global NGO in anti-corruption. We're a global movement of over 100 NGOs that form, so to speak, a federation. And we all work in over 100 countries. I am from the TI Secretariat, which is based in Berlin. And like you already mentioned, the Corruption Perceptions Index is our annual index of corruption. Every year, we use it to bring attention and raise awareness of the negative effects that corruption has on a number of issues. So a few years ago, we talked about the relationship between corruption and the decline of democracy around the world. Last year, we talked about its impact on political integrity. And we thought that this year it would be very timely to talk about, well, what everyone is talking about, which is the COVID pandemic. And what we thought was very important to underline this year was that, as you said, corruption is not only a health or COVID is not only a health or an economic crisis, but it also highlights everything that we know that corruption is bad for. So we know that corruption kills. We know that corruption costs lives. We know that corruption costs immense amounts of money worldwide. And I think the power of COVID this year somehow was that it gave us this issue that every country in the world had to face at the same time, and it really brought to light what the challenges are of fighting an emergency like this when you have different levels of corruption around the world. So I think what we know about corruption and what the report highlights is that corruption, diverts public funds when it comes to, for the provision of public goods. And this is something that we know. And now with COVID, we have seen more and more often. So it diverts funds away from the delivery of health services or education. And of course, in the case of COVID, the issue of health services was particularly important. And it also weakens how governments can respond to an emergency or a crisis. So this is something that we see whenever there is an emergency, regardless of what the nature of the emergency is. It can be an earthquake, a hurricane, or whatever. If you have high levels of corruption, if you have systemic corruption, then the response to the emergency is going to be much harder. So in terms of what we see in the report, this is a comparative report that covers 180 countries. And there are differences, of course, across continents and regions. But what we see is that there are, so to speak, good performers and bad performance in every region. So even within the most corrupt region that we have, which is has been sub-Saharan Africa for a number of years, we still have countries that score pretty well. So there are exceptions on both sides. So we have some very corrupt countries in Europe, some very well-governed countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's also to highlight that this is not only, it's not a regional issue, it's a global issue. And the second point that I would like to highlight as well is that corruption is not only a problem for the developing world, it's also a problem in the developed world. And I think this is sometimes something that we tend to forget. We think that, when we think about corruption, what we think about is bribery, and perhaps about bribery in a poor country, right? Which is not always the case. And this is also what COVID brought to light. So COVID was also this, helped us in a way highlight what we already knew, that grand corruption occurs. So there's perhaps the most damaging form of corruption is not this petty bribery, but these huge sums of money being deviated from services, from from health services or other sort of services for citizens, that ends up in the pockets of politicians or other elites. So this is what COVID really helped us highlight, and helped us highlight as well that it is not only the case in developing countries. It might happen, less frequently in developed ones, but is still a problem there. And finally, and then I would give the floor to the next speaker, just to close with this, is that what COVID also showed is that, oh God, I totally forgot the last point. Sorry. What COVID also showed is that when we have corruption, or when we have higher levels of corruption, what we also have are more undemocratic responses to crises. So in countries where corruption is high, we see responses to a crisis that tend to be not only less transparent, but also tend to infringe more on, human rights and other sort of democratic freedoms, such as freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I will leave it at that, and then we can explore the other angles of the report and the crisis.
Great, thank you. Well, just on that topic, so Jonathan, you've been working, I think, as I understand, on particularly on the health elements here and those intertwined things that Roberto was mentioning. Maybe you could tell us more about what you found.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, and good evening or good afternoon, everybody. I think my takeaway message would be that sadly, COVID has been a tale of two pandemics, really. It's been one of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in many countries, a tale of corruption in the response to it as well. We've seen across the globe, really, instances of corruption. And if you think back to, it's sadly almost a year ago, but kind of March, when the pandemic went global, the kind of great scramble to buy PPE, personal protective equipment, and the kind of subsequent corruption scandals that emerged there, substandard equipment, bribes being taken, overpriced equipment being sold. This has continued throughout the pandemic. We've seen kind of instances in Uganda of food aid corruption there, on all continents, and I'm trying desperately to avoid getting into a long discussion about the cases that we've seen here in the UK, the kind of what's been labelled chumocracy, but diversions and kind of use of direct tendering channels, which in many cases are justified in an emergency response, but the abuse of those channels for other purposes and to award contacts to friends or relatives. And we've seen those channels, I think, in one country in Eastern Europe, or where kind of security service equipment was being used, was being tendered for and bought directly under the pretext of the COVID pandemic. We've also seen more broadly the kind of the use, and as Roberto mentioned, the use of emergency legislation to crack down. And the most recent example, again, is in Uganda, the recent elections there, that the opposition candidates have kind of been hampered from campaigning under the pretext of preventing COVID spreading in the country. I think, perversely, on the flip side, working in the health sector, what the pandemic has done is shone a light on the complexities of the health sector and the vulnerabilities that there are within it to corruption. As Roberto mentioned, it's often perceived as kind of being corruption at the point of service delivery, that you're asked for a bribe, typically in a lower income setting, to access a healthcare worker. Something like that, to me, sitting in London, having the National Health Service is completely unthinkable. And I'd be straight in the police station if a doctor did that. But it's helped people understand the kind of complexities, there's PPE, all of these vulnerabilities there, that corruption opportunities are in the value chain, in the kind of health system. And it's also helped shine a light on the opaqueness of the system in many settings as well, that a lack of transparency allows for corruption to take place. And also, and I think this is becoming more and more important as we go forward with shrunk fiscal environments, there's more pressure to do more deliver more for each dollar. As economies contract, it also hampers efficiency as well. We know there's a lot of waste. We don't know how much is lost to corruption in the healthcare sector, because if you can be good at corruption, you want to hide it, basically. But we know that approximately 10 to 20% of global healthcare spend each year is lost due to inefficiency and corruption. That's a massive amount. It's an amount that would, if we were to reclaim it, would let us basically achieve Sustainable Development Goal 3, which is the healthcare goal. And as we emerge from the pandemic, I think the danger of corruption is still there. We've begun to see, and we were just talking before we started about the kind of vaccination that has begun to roll out in Western Europe and in the US. There are corruption vulnerabilities around that. We still have significant concerns, and that's deeply tied also to the issue of trust as well, that corruption and lack of transparency in the development of vaccines is crucial, and we all know about the kind of anti-vaxxer movement. Any sort of kind of any bit of information or lack of information that gives anti-vaxxer movement and others the ammunition will hamper the trust and will ultimately slow down the end of this pandemic. So I think as we move forward, move out of this, my call would be that we work with countries to improve the transparency of their health systems, begin to unpick this, and also, and I think we'll come on to this later, look at how we can build much more accountable public service delivery.
Yeah, you know, often with these indexes, because you do it annually and you sort of rank countries, it's a little bit of naming and shaming going on. Everyone looks quickly to where they are on the scale. Were there particular surprises to you or notable leaps forward or backward on the ratings as you looked at it? I looked at a couple countries that media were saying, oh, we're now dropped, but I wonder, as someone who works on it, you mean something you think everyone should know about that they could look at?
Yeah, well, every year we also publish the list of the so-called statistically significant changes, as in every other index. Of course, there's some measurement errors. So we publish the list of those that either improve or decrease beyond this measurement error. And I think one of the countries we have in total since 2012, around 48 countries that either improve or decrease. I think we have 26 countries improving between 2012 and now, and the remaining 22 getting worse. I think one of the ones that has made the most progress is, we see Estonia, for example, which has made incredible progress. I think it even improved 11 points between 2012 and now. And we also have countries like Armenia in Eastern Europe / Central Asia region that has also made a very big leap forward in the past couple of years. Actually, it's much more recent than the developments that we see in Estonia. In terms of like those that go down, I think there are not many surprises there. We have countries like sadly Venezuela, many countries also where we have a conflict such as Syria, Yemen, Liberia, et cetera. So I think, but the ones that I think are worth highlighting are, Armenia, Estonia, and there are a few more. We also have, unfortunately, a significant decline in Lebanon, decline in terms like getting worse in Lebanon. And I think, after the explosion, they've also really had a terrible response to the pandemic. And even though it is not statistically significant, we've also seen a worrying trend in the US score, which has declined around 9 points between 2016 and now. So that's, although it's not yet statistically significant, it's a worrying trend that if it were to continue, it's likely it will get to that in the next couple of years.
Right. And Jonathan, on the health issues, and just overall, I think what Roberto said, often people might think in the West, if you will, the advanced countries of Europe, the United States, that somehow this is something far away, but we realize it's really not. And especially with the race to get vaccines, to money gets you ahead of the line. And to what extent have we seen that in Western Europe, in the EU, if you will, the UK, the United States? Do you have anything on that in terms of how this has been affected, particularly in sort of the core advanced democratic countries?
Thanks. I mean, I think I think looking, obviously, the corruption, a lot of the Western Europe countries score fairly well on the CPI. And as I said, under the scenes, it's not always the case. When we looked, Roberto and I looked previously at the kind of ranking of countries to do with pandemic preparedness and disaster preparedness. Two top scores, I think, were the UK and the US. That ranking is sadly very out of date. And so it's not always the case that the country's kind of level of preparedness has reflected that kind of going forward. I think what we've also seen and this is moving away from this, but the geopolitics of this all, the kind of race to procure the vaccine. And we're seeing this playing out very much live in the UK and Europe in this new kind of post-Brexit era, where there are arguments going on about who should get the vaccine first, where supply should go. More worryingly, I think, around that is what's going to happen to the majority world. When are they going to get the vaccine? We're now talking about 2 to 3 years' time. What impact does that have on the kind of the continued economic development of countries, the ability of countries to focus to continue trading, global trade links, as well as the health and kind of social outcomes of populations there?
Well, so transitioning then, if I can bring Ben into the conversation, as I mentioned before, Ben Judah is written a lot on these issues, both in journalism, but also think tanks. He's a fellow with the Atlantic Council. He's been with the Hudson Institute. He just produced his own report. Ben, you can tell people about it if you want.
Thank you.
But Ben, your focus, takes a somewhat different bent, and it's also not just about what's going on globally, but particularly within the West and how Western institutions can be enablers of these corrupt flows, if you will. So, how do you kind of this index and your own work, and what do you think are the takeaways we should have from particularly this past year of total craziness?
Thank you so much. And first, I wanted to say how honored I am to be asked to participate in an event associated with the Corruption Perceptions Index, which has really been such a formative and totemic piece of research coming out annually in the anti-corruption space for many years. And it's something that I've seen working as a journalist in Russia, in the Middle East, and across Europe, and in Pakistan, is so frequently cited in civil society debates that it's really had the ability to frame conversations and move conversations forward. So I just wanted to thank everybody who's been involved in this and supported it for so many years. My own analysis of the role of corruption and illicit finance internationally is very much focused on the West. It's very much focused on trying to understand the role of London, New York, the offshore financial hubs under the sovereign territory of the United States, the UK, or the EU within the Democratic Alliance or the Western Alliance, and studying how many of the most sort of elite professions present in this space, bankers, lawyers, hedge funders, to sort of mention a topic of a lot of popularity today, have functioned as the enablers of international kleptocrats, and that our own regulatory failures and zones of limited to no regulatory or authority have enabled authoritarian kleptocracies and corrupt individuals to convert these illicit sources of cash rooted through the West into new sources of power and authority, not only in their home countries, but also build influence within the West, which brings us to a nice segue to the last few years and what happened in the Trump era in Washington. So just as a little bit of biography, I moved to Washington just before the start of the Trump era, maybe 6 months before. And when I arrived in mid 2016, our issue was an important issue, but it was maybe the 200th or the 300th of the important issues the United States was concerned with internationally. It was viewed as an issue for academics, specialists, development folks, and other people who, though with a respected place inside foreign policy, were not seen as kind of being absolutely central to developing any democratic or US foreign policy strategy. What happened in the Trump era was that perception was transformed. The kleptocratic activities of Trump's White House, the visible kind of alliance between certain corrupt sectors in the US and abroad, the unanswered questions around Trump's own wealth and foreign contacts meant that what had been an academic discussion became a daily discussion in the US press, a constant conversation in Washington, and the front page, not only of the New York Times, but of campaigning magazines like the Atlantic. This, corruption perception transformation in Washington led to a political revolution in the politics of anti-corruption, which I sort of witnessed firsthand. Our issue went from being something that, if we were lucky, we got a chance to brief the leading presidential candidates on in an election cycle, into a topic that was placed really at the center of Elizabeth Warren's campaign for the presidency, the community of wonks and specialists that she assembled really developed a lot of extremely good work associated with this. It was put front and center by Bernie Sanders in his campaign for the presidency. Again, a huge and impressive body of work there was elaborated on. And Joe Biden from the very beginning, even though he's a centrist candidate, specified that anti-corruption was a key part of his national security vision. So corruption went from being at the periphery to being at the center of the US conversation about foreign policy. And just you sort of mentioned that how many people were listening to us today. It's a sort of a number I couldn't have imagined in 2015, 2016. I think that's a testament to that. So that's the end of my first point, that we've now lived through this revolution in how corruption is perceived politically in Washington. And the result is that we have, as you sort of quoted earlier on, Dan, Joe Biden saying this is a priority. We had Jake Sullivan, the sort of NSC advisor designate, saying that it is his loftiest ambition to get rally Americans' allies around the sort of a rule-based order for finance and illicit finance. And we've had statements to this effect also from other key figures in the administration. So that's what's happening here. My second point is that this has been happening whilst there's been the beginnings, and I stress only the beginnings, of a regulatory convergence between the three main poles of the sort of Western or the global financial system still, which is the United States, the UK, and the EU. In the EU, we've seen an improvement in how Europe deals with this problem after major scandals, such as the Danske Bank scandal, revealing huge quantities of illicit finance coming in from Russia, much of it linked to the Putin family, both literally and metaphorically itself. Europe's brought in a requirement for beneficial ownership registries is beginning to be implemented. We have the 5th anti-money laundering directive, a lot of good stuff there. Meanwhile, in the UK, we've seen the UK move forward to impose beneficial ownership registries on its many offshore territories, a sort of empire, one could say, of financial centres around the world in the sort of remaining scraps of the British Empire, mostly concentrated in the Caribbean and around the British Isles. And meanwhile, in the United States, there's been more convergence as well, again focusing on this issue of beneficial ownership. And just in case somebody doesn't know, beneficial ownership is the question of who owns a company. You know, it's the ability for law enforcement to identify who owns a block of flats or a corporation, so on and so forth, or a simple shell company. So in the US, we had the NDAA, that's the name for the defense bill, which included a whole host of anti-corruption and anti-money laundering measures. The most important one is a beneficial ownership registry. So we've seen this convergence. The task now for the Biden administration, for Democrats, for supporters of US foreign policy in Washington and allies around the world, is how do we turn this intellectual breakthrough, how do we turn this convergence into a real moment of transatlantic cooperation? And I think that 2021, even though it is such a difficult time with the pandemic and this pandemic of corruption, which I thought was so eloquently expressed by the panel earlier, offers us a sequence of summits which could be key to unlocking a global kleptocracy initiative. We have the G7, which will be taking place in the UK, a major financial centre with both an interest and a problem as regards to this. We've got the commitment from Biden and Tony Blinken for a summit of or for democracies. They appear to keep toggling it back and forth, and it's got quite different implications. And I think that there's a chance for the EU, the UK, and the US, shepherded hopefully by the folk in the White House and especially the NSC now, to propose a package for agreement. Like, what could this look like? I've actually got a forthcoming report on this that will be launched through the Centre of American Progress in a few weeks, but just to sort of trail it a little bit, there is a really good example of what happened with the Proliferation Security Initiative in the Bush administration, a political commitment to a political set of standards and increased cooperation between law enforcement, data sharing, and a regulatory alignment in an informal structure that really made a difference in dealing with WMD at a crucial moment, just over 15 years ago. So that's where I'd like to conclude, which is it's grounds for optimism. And maybe my final comment would be that I think that the work that has been done over really the decades in raising the prominence of this issue should not be slacked off on now. Not that I know anyone who's expecting to do it. And I think it's the moment for us to redouble our efforts in the anti-corruption community, and not to mistake a satisfaction that Biden is in the White House with a need to tone down the criticism. If anything, now is a moment to step up the criticism, to step up the push, and to make sure that delivery happens. Because as any kind of policy professional knows, getting from statement of intent to an effective system is a long journey indeed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so we've kind of widened the aperture here to talk about the broader phenomenon. We are having a number of questions come in, and I want to again repeat for the audience, if you'd like to send us a comment or a question, you can send it via email at gep@wilsoncenter.org, gep@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at wilsoncentergep. So let me, if I can, weave in a few of these questions. And I'll just give you a number of them and then come back to our speakers. And for the speakers, I think, feel free to pick or choose. Don't feel compelled to answer every question or try to, because I think some are directed more to others than everyone. On the health issue itself, a question from Diana Negroponte, who's one of our fellows. She gives the example in the city of New York. They have a very well-established sort of system called concierge medicine, in which you pay in advance for medical services for a particular doctor's practice, which means you get, ensures your access. You pay for access, basically. And that also assures access to the vaccine. So your ability to pay is the ability to get ahead of the line. And what does that say about, how do we deal with something like that, which is a well-established practice, and now we see with the vaccine, it's making some difference. That's an example she has. The other question related on the health is about the efficiency of the vaccines and corruption. We were saying, I think Roberto was saying it, it weakens the efficiency of distribution. It makes us all less. So how do we pick that apart? What can we do to tackle that so we can, in fact, deliver vaccines? So those are on the health-related questions. But on the broader issues, we have a number of questions, particularly, again, geared back to sort of Western, if you will, institutions. One is someone who's been observing, if I may say, it seems like Transparency International's own work, commenting that the Vatican has been, Vatican funds, if you want to say that, have been severely mismanaged for a long time. And yet Transparency International doesn't seem to pay much attention to the Vatican role in corruption flows. I don't know if that's true or not. I'll let you comment on that. And there are many questions about the role of the UK, frankly. As Ben said, it's trying to be a solution, but it's got a problem. One audience member says, the major accounting firms in London are most corrupt in the world, but not one accountant has been stripped of his chartered accountancy. Why is that? What is the role of the UK in terms of the flows of money that enable Russian oligarchs and others to continue their business? And broadly, in money laundering by banks such as Barclays, Standard Chartered, HSBC, Swiss banks, unidentified companies, directors and staff, and it's all being shifted, oil and drug revenue out of London. And the questioner also gives a little tweak to Transparency International. So why are you still based in Berlin? Shouldn't you be in London? I realize you have a network, but you get the sense of some of these. Also, the Grenfell episode, which was the fire in the high rise. It showed great fraud in the construction business. Many people died. There was huge hardship. His Transparency International paid attention to these types of issues as well. Maybe you have other studies, but these are the kind of questions. And the last one before we can go back to you all is just the broader notion of the flows here. And Ben was sort of making the case, things are turning around a little bit. I've always been struck, this is my personal impression, in Europe. Ben mentioned the Danske Bank scandal. That, as I recall, was uncovered by the US Treasury. It was US Treasury investigation pressing Europe's regulators to sort of, really look at this and basically pushing the authorities in Europe to take this seriously. You had another example in Moldova, where maybe a quarter of the entire country's, GDP suddenly ended up in a bank in Latvia. And again, it was US Treasury that identified and went after this. So where are the European regulators on all this stuff? Isn't this the EU? Aren't there regulatory, aren't people doing their job here? Where is the breakdown? So I realize that's a lot of questions, but like I say, just pick or choose which ones you think you can address, and I'm sure by the end we'll get to that. Roberto, can I turn back to you first?
Sure. Well, I can say a few things. There's a lot to unpack there, but in terms of this model that we see in New York, for example, the one that was just mentioned, I think, although I would not say it is corrupt per se, I think this is precisely one of the problems of, when you're dealing with a public good that is scarce as well. So in New York, you have maybe already established these systems. In developing countries, there is not even knowledge that this is happening. It will probably happen in an informal manner. And that's a problem with distribution of the vaccine. The other problem where we can see like a huge, where I would, as Jonathan also mentioned during his intervention, one of the big issues, if you're looking at developing countries, could be that, and we're already seeing this, for example, is that if there is no transparency, if there is no accountability in how the vaccines are being distributed, we have already seen in some countries, politicians getting preference to their families rather than to those who are at the front line of the COVID, the fight against COVID, so to speak. So I think that's in the way in which corruption can really make this worse and affect the effectiveness of the response and the vaccine. To comment just briefly on the Vatican, it's not that that Transparency International ignores the Vatican in any way, shape, or form. In the case of the Corruption Perceptions Index, the reason why the Vatican is not there is just simply that there are not enough sources giving us information on the Vatican. So also, since we're talking about illicit financial flows and the role of enablers and so on, this is also a part of corruption that the CPI itself does not really capture, but Transparency International is working on this issue. So for the past few years, we have also started to acknowledge, well, not started to acknowledge, but we also publish a feature called Trouble at the Top, where we talk precisely about what we've been talking about, the issues in Denmark, that even though, it has a score of 88 in the CPI, all of this is still happening. And I think where we need to draw the line as well is all of these countries that we're mentioning, like the UK, Denmark, and most of the EU, I think in these cases, the public sector itself is indeed very clean. The rule of law is already established, and this is what makes it so attractive to bring money into these countries to keep it there. And where we need to work a lot is on the regulation to not allow corrupt countries to bring the money here and just let it sit there. There was also a report, I believe, by TI UK looking at real estate ownership in central London. So I think it is crucial to address the issue of illicit financial flows and the enablers in developing countries. Sorry, in developed countries in like on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think, as Ben also said, I think it's time for the EU and the US to lead by example. And it's time not only to continue to promise that more will be done, but to actually act upon it. I'm sure I missed many things, but I'll just get back to you and can continue asking questions later,
Sure.
answering questions later.
That's fine. Jonathan?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, to pick up first of all on this kind of point that your colleague raised, the enabling access to healthcare. I mean, obviously the US system is a private system where effectively in many cases money talks, and as a health professional, generally that is not something we aim for. I mean, globally, there's a kind of effort to move towards universal health coverage. And we've seen, again, President Biden's kind of reaffirmed support for what was termed Obamacare to ensure that everybody's got access to healthcare. And generally, the principle is that those that need healthcare most should be prioritized. It shouldn't be about those that have got the cash to pay to be on the preferential list of a doctor in New York City being the first to get a vaccine. And that's the same. Corruption in the vaccine distribution is effectively kind of impacting on that. It's at one level, it's people who are actually kind of jumping the gun. We've seen reports here kind of wealthy people from London flying out to Dubai to get the vaccine where it's more accessible. And there are other stories kind of picking up around the world as the vaccine comes out. Most countries, well, all countries have adopted a policy really of targeting those that need it first. The rest of you, tough. You just have to wait, basically. In most cases, that's going to be healthcare workers and then the vulnerable populations. And obviously that varies by country, but basically that you work backwards in terms of age, and then those who've got other existing health conditions. If that system isn't followed, then that is a form of corruption, but it will impact on the health of the population. There are other corruption risks in the kind of the vaccine rollout particularly around the kind of supply chain issues. Are the supply chains weak? And also if these opportunities kind of pop up that you think I can buy the vaccine from a doctor that I know that if I pay $100 for it, do we know whether that vaccine is actually the proper vaccine? And we know, for instance, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has very stringent storage conditions. If somebody's basically selling that out of the back of a car somewhere, it may not be the right thing. That will hamper the distribution of it and hamper the effectiveness of it. Picked up the other question I was going to touch on was kind of the question of corruption and efficiency. So I'm not entirely sure whether it's directed towards the CPI analysis, but I just want to say in the health sector, it's very difficult to separate out what is corruption and what is inefficiencies. The way to do it is to open up those systems. And we know in a lot of countries, in the UK's got it, a lot of other countries, we have open contracting systems, open procurement systems, where you can see, in theory, there hasn't been adhered to in the pandemic, but you can see what's going on there. You can see who's been awarded those tenders, what those are for, and you can begin to start to look at some of these activities and start to kind of question what is potentially corrupt, what is just poor planning, and poor distribution there.
Yeah.
Lastly, just to add, and I don't work on the UK side of things, we do work in countries, and the case of London, so we have a chapter, my host chapter where I work looks at corruption and transparency in the UK. We've done a report on professional enablers and have done quite a bit of work kind of on the role of London and the UK as a global centre. Do look at the Transparency UK website for the reports. I am not a subject specialist on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben, what do you make of all this?
Well, those were really kind of great answers by the rest of the panel just now. So I'll add to where I can add, but I think they've covered this, really well. I don't think it's very, very important to talk about, and was touched upon in a lot of these questions, is the question of regulation, enforcement, effectiveness, and the gap between what's on the books and what's in reality. So I think it's very important to start with making it very clear that one of the biggest problems we have in anti-corruption is that we already have pretty strong laws in the UK and in the US and in the EU, but these laws are either not enforced, there are no penalties for enforcing them, or there has been a lack of seriousness and a declining seriousness in going after white-collar crime by law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic now for some decades. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. You know, the first thing that needs to be stated is that money laundering is a crime on all sides of the Atlantic. And there is, you know, the reason that so much money laundering goes on is that there is really poor enforcement mechanisms, either to make sure to investigate that this is going on, or to bring the perpetrators of this to justice. Working out why there is such a big gap between what's on the books, what's happening in reality, what our statements are, and what's actually going on underneath the hood, forces us to go into often a quite complicated policy analysis, which is critically important. Let's have a look at beneficial ownership. The UK has been a leader on this by bringing in a beneficial ownership registry for UK companies. But that's not enough, because there's been non-enforcement, no checking of whether the information has been entered correctly or not. When I last checked, which was a few days ago, so it may have changed, but I don't think it has, there's only ever been one prosecution for falsely entering fake beneficial ownership information. And that was for a gentleman who, you know, sort of colleague in our anti-corruption community, that did it as a stunt to show that they weren't enforcing this. So a beneficial ownership registry isn't enough on its own. We need a beneficial ownership registry that's checked, accurate, with enforcement mechanisms to make sure that people, you know, don't feel that they've got nothing to lose by putting in false information. So what does that mean? You know, this takes us again into quite a complicated piece of policy thinking. You know, just describing that issue, this, like all public policy problems, this is also a data problem. You know, where's the data being stored? How's it being analyzed? How easy is it for it to be shared between different kind of partners within the state, outside the state? If it is being shared, like what format is the information coming out in? Like one quickly ends up in quite a technical area, which is, I would argue, even more important to get right than the kind of campaigning side of things, the outrage side of things, which is easier and more gratifying. So that's sort of where we are right now in the UK and in the EU to a certain extent on this problem. You know, we're not quite there yet in the US because we haven't even brought in some of those basic things that we need to here, but that's what we need to be looking ahead at, thinking ahead at on how to design the systems, how to make them work, and also how to keep our campaign focused on that once we don't have the satisfaction of shock horror kind of claims or headlines. You know, so that's sort of where I am, and we need to really guard against the danger of passing laws that we don't have any capacity or intention to enforce, which will only create a deeper gulf between our books and our reality, undermining our own credibility. So, you know, that's my answer on the system. You know, I just want to very, very quickly say something about a lot of these questions actually seem to be asking a question that was nudging in the direction of social democracy, going, is the corruption of the state and the corruption not linked to the corruption of the financial system? And would this not be resolved by a greater state role in the provision of healthcare, in the provision of healthcare, in the provision of kind of more public services more generally? And the only thing that I can say, just as an analyst, even though my political interest should be very clear at this point, is that's interestingly enough, that's the argument that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren advanced. You know, their argument about corruption was never one that was uniquely supposed to be an us, them, foreign kleptocrats, domestic innocents, framing. You know, arguments about corruption and policies about corruption were happening within the United States and linked to healthcare were core to the agenda they were putting forward. You know, that's not the agenda that Biden was putting forward. So one of the things that I'm interested about, concerned about, excited to see how it develops is how the hirings shake out to do with corruption, how much interest that the Biden administration has in clamping down on the domestic side of the ledger and not just the foreign side of the ledger. So far, you know, some positive signs, you know, but Biden has hired, you know, Elizabeth Warren's foreign policy advisor to do policy for the NSC, really positive sign. And what are we going to see next in terms of hires from other campaigns or other posts that are going to be filled? I would advise everyone to have a close look at the hirings. And if you're concerned about the link between the domestic and the foreign, the blurring between the domestic and the foreign, this is an area for one to campaign about, to make sure that there are stronger people or stronger roles. So the question to be asked is, will there be an anti-corruption envoy? Will there be an anti-corruption deputy assistant secretary of state? You know, that's something that I'm very keen to see happen. And I think that if people asking those questions should also be tweeting and arguing in favor of them.
Okay, thank you. So a couple questions again. Back on the health issue, you know, Commissioner Vera Jourova has said when the EU money is coming for the recovery, it's going to be a flood of money, she says, a flood of money. And we have to watch out because of the corruption influences that will come for that. And a lot of this money is geared both to dealing with the pandemic and also dealing with the economy. So I just wonder, Roberto, or maybe you're particularly focused on the EU element here. What's in place within the EU system to guard against the flood of money being diverted when it finally reaches some member states? And then a separate question, but also back on sort of Europe in a way, but farther east, from Bill Drozdiak, who again is a global fellow with us. He says, why do you think Alex Navalny's corruption charges against Vladimir Putin are having such a dramatic effect now, even though the extent of Putin's kleptocracy has been known for many years? Should Western governments meddle by publicizing more information about Putin's corruption, or would such efforts backfire by generating anti-Western sentiments in Russia? So how do we engage with what is clearly the Putin regime of all this? And what's the best way forward? And why is it particularly new, seems to be new now to so many people when it's not been news for a long time? So Roberto, you want to take on either of those or both?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, in terms of like opening the gate, so to speak, to this flood of money that's going to come, that is indeed a concern. And the problem is, like, of course, different countries within the EU have different levels of preparedness to handle this money. It's not only, I mean, we have even been seeing cases of corruption with the previous development aid, so to speak, that the EU distributes. So these like structural funds that the EU distributes, for example, there are countries like mostly in Eastern Europe, such as Bulgaria or Romania, that tend to have also some of the lowest scores on the CPI in the region, where these funds have just been completely misused. So of course, it is important to talk about this. And I think there's been a lot of pressure also within the EU to invest in this like rule of law mechanism that is called. But of course, there's also a lot of, you know, not every country is happy to do this, because some of the countries that would need most of these funds are also the ones that would be punished by the rule of law mechanism. So just as I was referring to the statistically significant changes in the CPI before, and Poland and Hungary are two of these countries where we see like regression in terms of corruption. And yeah, these are two countries that are going to need you know, funds to fight the pandemic, and that definitely do not have strong enough systems to prevent corruption from happening. There are already kleptocratic networks in place in Hungary, for example. So it is a concern, and I think the EU definitely needs to pay extra attention to this. In terms of what we're doing to prevent this, like Transparency International has what we call integrity pacts, for example, which is following big procurement processes and big projects from a civil society point of view to ensure that the money gets to where it is supposed to go. So these types of this type of audits, for example, by civil society or even by the state institutions, I think will be crucial in the EU once these funds are being disbursed. Yeah, I hope that answered at least one of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Ben, I know you know a lot about the Russia front. You want to try that second question?
Well, yes, I'll be very grateful, actually. You know, I wrote a book actually about sort of Russia and Putin's regime and its sort of challenges from the opposition, a lot of which was about Navalny. And this book came out in 2012. So this has been a really long-term, like long building issue. When I did the analysis of, you know, what were the checks and limits on the civil society rising and mass protest movement that began in the Bolotnaya protests of 2011 and went through 2012 into 2013, you know, there were a couple of limits on Navalny's message. The first was less than half the Russian population had access to the internet. There was still, you know, significant presence of very elderly sort of Soviet generation, you know, age 70 plus. A new generation was still too young, was still often at school or unaware of what was going on. And there was no presence of his movement really outside Moscow. You know, his movement was present in Moscow, and even in St. Petersburg, the movement was not really established to the same degree. And if you went to, you know, places like Novosibirsk or Voronezh, there was just not a real presence of it. So fast forward now, one sees really, firstly, you know, there's been a generational turnover. You know, the generational competition is just different than it was. And you have not, you know, my generation of aging millennials really at the forefront of this. We have, you know, what they sort of call Zoomers, people are a little bit younger than us, you know, in the early 20s or teens, you know, digital natives, and who are, unlike, say, myself, someone who has sort of, you know, a few memories of the socialist bloc, in my case, because my father was working in Romania at the time. These are people who've only ever known, you know, Russia under Putin and Russia as an underperforming, stable, and in the international pecking order, a relatively respected and relatively wealthy state. So they're at the forefront of this. And then there's been a breakthrough in terms of online, social media. Really, the vast crushing majority of the population has access. And then this is no longer a movement consolidated only in Moscow. My final point, is there's a 2-minute warning, is Putin, for me, used to be a master of the image. Putin used to be very good at TV. And when it was Putin versus Navalny in 2011, Putin, who's very bad at this, is not a natural at this, did these, you know, mass rallies in sort of sports stadiums in puffer jackets, like yelling into microphones, like showing himself to be, you know, the voice of Russia, the lion of Russia. None of that anymore. And Putin appeared going into some sort of ice bath last week, sort of looking sort of bloated and just physically strange, physically very odd after, you know, what may be many issues. And Putin allowed Navalny to write a movie script about himself, involving him returning back to Russia with his wife, this sort of love story contrasted to the loneliness of the Tsar, and to be filmed by all international media. So Putin, I think, has lost his touch in terms of image management.
Thank you, Ben. We're going to have to leave it there, coming up on the hour. I want to thank the audience for joining us, and for our panelists, Roberto and Jonathan and Ben, for a really stimulating conversation on a real challenge we all face. You can find the Transparency International Index by going to the Transparency International website. I think Ben, you can find Ben's recent report out as well by searching for him on that. And otherwise, we hope to keep attention to this topic. It's an ongoing one, not going away anytime soon, and hope to engage with you all again on this. So thank you again. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.